deaths due to COVID-19, immunizations.
Deaths in vaccinated people.
The fatality count is already higher than the wars that we call wars in our memorable lifetime. The difference is that the agencies through which they're killed are delivered in lab coats. This was a biological war, and we are in the middle of it.
You've talked about these vaccine injured, and you've talked about 2028 and a third of the world affected by the vaccine. That's a huge number. We see so many anecdotal cases out there of these sudden deaths and these blood clots and these sudden cancers. Does the public have any idea what's going on?
People say, oh, tens of thousands or millions of people were allegedly saved because they got the vaccine. That's absolute, excuse the French, bullshit.
Fear and the weaponization of fear, it's something we touch on in our film. It's something that will happen again throughout human history. Ultimately, the more we can bulletproof ourselves individually, the stronger we can be for whatever is going to be thrown at us in the future.
I think one of the roles you've played, certainly I've seen this in your own life, is to be a role model that says we can still stand. When everything else is falling, we can still stand. And yeah, do we get bumped and bruised a lot? Of course we do. But do we allow that to define our existence? Absolutely not, because the character of who we are stands against any of those attacks.
I always talk about my time in 2020 as this incredible proof that a small group of people was able to fight trillion-dollar technology companies and, quite frankly, win.
Thank you for the film that you did, We Will Not Be Silenced. This is a message people need to hear, and I think the way in which you engage your interviews celebrates the nature of the humility of the quest for truth and information, and I'm always grateful to be part of that.
The world is changing. Inspiration is everywhere. It has never been so easy to connect, share, and bring people together. We're learning from others and finding the best in ourselves. Challenging our beliefs. Sharing our vulnerability. Overcoming our fears. Transforming ourselves so we can transform the world. How far can we go?
This is London Real. I am Brian Rose. My guest today is...
Hi, it's Brian Rose from London Real. You probably know that we've just recently been re-platformed on YouTube after 25 months completely in the dark. The truth is, I really need your help. What I really need you to do is click on that subscribe button right now, like this video, and maybe even leave a comment or share the link with friends. We're really fighting against an algorithm that's tried to keep us quiet for so long, and the more subscribers we have, the more people watch our content, the better guests we can bring you, the better content, and we can continue transforming lives. We've been doing this for 14 years now. I want to do this for another 14 years, but I really need your help. So click on that subscribe button, like the video, leave a comment, share this, and we're going to continue to bring you more and more great content. Thank you. This is London Real. I am Brian Rose. My guest today is Dr. David Martin, the American author, professor, and researcher. You are the founder and CEO of MCAM, which provides research and advice to over 160 countries regarding finance, patents, and trade. You were the central figure in the documentary film Plandemic 2, where you exposed the elaborate web of deception and lies by governments, corporations, and regulators that caused the COVID-19 pandemic. You believe that COVID was a pre-planned act of biological and chemical warfare perpetrated on the human race, and that the vaccine does not trigger an immune response, but instead instructs the body to manufacture a known toxic pathogen. You say that we are in the middle of World War III, and that between now and 2028, a third of the global population will become disabled and debilitated as a result of the vaccine rollout. David, welcome back to London Real.
Brian, it is always an honor to be here with you. Thank you for having me.
My pleasure. We have quite a history, 4 years, I think, and I can't wait to jump in.
We do indeed. We do indeed. You were the one that had the courage a pandemic in front of a world audience when the world was shutting everything else down. And for that, we will be forever grateful. Mickey and I are super grateful.
Thank you for that. Really appreciate it. I definitely upset quite a few people in the Alphabet network. I still remember getting a call from someone at YouTube in August. I was actually on holiday in Turkey when they opened up the flights for about a week, and they called me up and they kind of read me the riot act and completely demonetized my account, took me out of every partnership program, and said, if you pull something like this ever again, then we're going to deplatform you, which they did, but they waited 3 years. So yeah, it was completely worth it, is all I have to say. And so again, really a big shout out to you and Mickey for making that incredible film, Plandemic 2. People really need to go watch it and rewatch it, because this was August 2020, and you laid out everything that would later now be confirmed as pretty much the same truth that comes out of the White House press room. And that's incredible, really.
Yeah.
We can dive into the movie, but I just wanted to jump in and start with a quote that you said recently, and that was, quote, "You were injected with a thing to make you a customer of Big Pharma that has been in the business of killing the world's citizens since 1604. You went on to say, remember, a third of the people fell for it, a third of the people were coerced, and a third of the people said no," unquote. David, I wanted to understand what you mean by World War III.
Yeah, Brian, this is a great question, because we, as anyone who's paying attention knows, we're living in a world where there has been a universal assault on sovereignty of the individual. Liberty is a concept that we now fantasize about, but none of us have it. We have gradations of some form of liberty, but we don't have liberty anywhere. There's no place on earth that currently is embracing principles that were enshrined in the latter part of the 18th century, when we said life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness were essential human values. So liberty is out the window. But let's talk very specifically about the hallmarks of what it means to be at world war. This is an extremely important point. If we go back into the Medici era, and a lot of people wouldn't expect me to go there, but there you go, I just went. There was a very famous study done by the Duke of Swiss. And in that study, he looked at how much of a currency had to be undermined in its confidence before a country was functionally no longer sovereign. And this was around the idea of counterfeit as a weapon of warfare. Because it turns out, and by the way, in the United States, for people who pay attention, the reason why the counterfeiting crime in the United States is modulated by the Secret Service in the United States is because counterfeit is seen as an assault on the executive branch of government. It is actually a direct attack on a country. And if you look at what has happened in the last now period of time since 2011 going into 2012, I have argued that we have already passed the tipping point that was established in all of the research that was done that said that a currency, once it's destabilized, once more than 3 or 4% of it, of this circulating currency, is counterfeit, at that point in time, we don't have a functioning state. The reason why I point this out is, if we recall during the COVID alleged pandemic, we saw this uncanny and nearly irrational printing of money. Not money that existed. It was money that just we made up. We just decided print more. But we also stopped reporting, Brian, a couple of the very important reporting mechanisms that we used to do to record the quality of our monetary policy. We stopped reporting the velocity of money. We stopped reporting the actual degree to which circulating currency was actually supporting real business. And what we did was we counterfeited a currency, which is an act of war. We then convinced the rest of the world to counterfeit currencies, by the way, and we created what are called synthetic drawing rights. And these things are funny money. They're like a monopoly exchange that people can get into or not at will. We saw counterparty currency agreements drafted between countries like India and China, Saudi Arabia and China, these bilateral currency agreements and trade agreements. And so if we look at the fundamentals of what does it mean to be at war, let's look at the fundamentals. Number one, we have a lack of sovereign nation state status. Number two, we have a depression or suppression of liberty. And number three, we have the erosion of currency confidence and trade confidence. And we met those standards entirely by the time we hit the beginning of this pandemic. So when we're technically in a world war, not only do I mean that, but we have another problem which is more insidious, and that is across the entirety of the United States and Europe. We are actually currently watching our small businesses, we are watching our farmers, we are watching all sorts of industries being crushed out of existence by commercial restrictive trade practices, dumping practices, and all sorts of other things. In fact, our monetary and our economic policy and strength have been entirely hijacked by what we refer to generally as the Belt Road Initiative. And what this tangibly means is that while we may say that we have aircraft carriers and we have certain numbers of boots on the ground that we can deploy at a military level, the functional case can be made that since 2012, and certainly codified in 2020 with a coup in the United States, and let's call a coup what it is. And the reason I call it a coup is because beginning in September 19th of 2019, the public health infrastructure of the United States intended to and ultimately prevailed in the overthrow of the democratic process of changing power in the United States. Let's be very clear. When you cannot go to the polls, when you cannot elect people, you cannot have gatherings of people to debate policy, you cannot have any of the tools of democracy, and then you run into a vote which has no ability to be verified because it's done in electronic forms. It's done in delayed and early and absentee balloting and all of the things that we did. The reason I say this is a coup is not sympathetic to one party or the other party. I'm simply saying that the democratic transition of power was impossible when you could go to polls. You could not stand in lines unless you were 6 feet apart. You couldn't be informed. You couldn't have public debate. You couldn't have any of the tools of democracy, which means that the transition of power, regardless of its outcome, was the overthrow of the democratic process of the United States. So by every definition, by December 2020, we were in a war. And the part that's most tragic is the fatality count is already higher than the wars that we call wars in our memorable lifetime. More people have been casualties of this war, but the difference is that the agencies through which they're killed are delivered in lab coats and stethoscopes and hospitals. And because we're not paying attention to what the armaments look like, and because we don't look at what the uniforms look like, we're waiting to see tanks in the streets. And we don't see that this was a biological war unleashed on the global population, and we are in the middle of it. This is World War III.
Well, now that makes more sense. We're pretty deep in the blockchain industry, and one thing that that Bitcoin helps with is it shows you a parallel universe of a monetary system that isn't tampered with. And so so that community is quite educated actually in the flaws of the fiat system and the printing of money. And there's a very famous guy, I'm sure you know him, his name is Michael Saylor, CEO of a company called MicroStrategy. And during the massive printing of money in 2020, he looked around and looked at his public company balance sheet and realized that it wasn't ethical for him to hold cash on that balance sheet anymore, and that he had to convert it into Bitcoin. And so when you talk about this stuff, it makes a lot of sense to us and a lot of our community because we can see those flaws, although your average American might not see it right away, although I think they're getting better educated. Obviously, when inflation goes up and it's talked about a little bit more, but I love the fact that you put everything together because yes, the democratic process was interfered with. I mean, I ran to be mayor of London in 21 here in London, and I literally had the police stop me, and they arrested me for campaigning when we were supposed to be locked down. And I thought campaigning was a communication issue. I was literally walking down the street talking to my phone, social distance from everybody, and they actually gave my whole crew fines and were going to arrest us. So I know.
But Brian, let's hit that one, because your free speech campaign, which is absolutely critical, is something that's worth noting. We had a judge in Massachusetts, and many people forget this, but the very first judge in the Massachusetts case against Governor Baker made the comment that social media stood in the place of the public sphere, where essentially, because we had things like Zoom, we had things like Facebook, we had things like, instant messengers and Instagrams and TikToks and all these things. The argument that the judge made was that we were not limited in speech because we had social media. And you and I both know that that was not just a oversight by the judge. That was a willful and negligent statement, because what he did not say was that none of those platforms ensured the ability for any speech to happen before it was state sanctioned. So your point, and I'm glad that you brought up the walking around in London socially distanced. You were trying to beforehand the rules of the road that were laid down, which were nonsense, as we said. But the point is, we were deprived of the capacity to speak. It's not an open and free point. So I'm glad that you raised it, because I think we need to remember that that was taken and it has never been restored.
Yeah, and we could take this a step further, because, I got into this very public fight with YouTube at the time. April 6th, we had the second largest YouTube live stream in the world, and that video was then taken down and my content started to be censored. And when I stood up and said, wait a second, what about my constitutional rights? What about, European Union Act 17 that says I can do this? And they said, no, that's a private company. You signed their agreement and you have to abide by their rules. First of all, that's the way people were communicating. But the real rub was later when I found out that the governments were actually instructing those companies to censor me and violate my rights. And they were using them as a proxy. And, while we're on the subject, we recently premiered our film, We Will Not Be Silenced, that talks about that. And Mike Benz was in the audience to watch it. And it was funny because during the movie, he was kind of laughing to himself. And I thought, wow, I don't know. I didn't know this was a comedy. But later he said, Brian, I knew what was happening behind the scenes that you were feeling at the tip of the spear. And I knew what the governments were trying to tell the YouTubes of the world. And you could even see that their policies changed because they were reacting in real time. And now it makes more sense to me what happened. Of course, understanding it doesn't make it right. And so, yeah, I'm glad you brought that up and the nuance of that. And you could go to so many layers on this, because it's funny, when the channel RT Russia Today used to be up and it was on YouTube, it would have a warning that said this is state-sponsored media. And yet when the BBC puts videos up, it doesn't put that same warning, which is obviously ridiculous. You've talked about these vaccine injured, David, and you've talked about 2028 and a third of the world. That's a huge number. And we see so many anecdotal cases out there of these sudden deaths and these blood clots and these sudden cancers and accelerated cancers. Can you tell me what's actually happening out there? And does the public have any idea what's going on?
Well, I think, like you said it earlier, there's the beginning of the awakening that people are starting to realize that something was grossly misrepresented. I mean, just a couple of days ago, we saw that both at the United Airlines case and then more recently, another individual employee who has prevailed in their suit against their employer for actually mandating without accommodating, in these cases, religious exemptions or health exemptions in some of the cases. But yes, Brian, it's important for us to get really on why I say a third of the population will be disabled or at least in some way incapacitated by 2028. And I need to correct that. I think it's happening faster than 2028. I think I was giving myself a long way than is appropriate. But let's unpack what I mean by that. Every person that got an mRNA injection, so that's Pfizer and Moderna, every person that got that injection is no longer capable of actually living in a what we call qualified human healthy existence. And the reason I say that is very simple. For 10 years, from 2000 to 2010, the company Moderna was the actual National Science Foundation project called Darwinian Chemical Systems, funded by the National Science Foundation. And that project specifically aimed to find ways to use mRNA to actually transcribe into the DNA of humans and other organisms. And the reason why Moderna was actually founded in 2010 was because they figured out how to do it. So let's get really clear. When you hear Moderna say, well, we don't think it actually does anything long term, that's a patent lie. And when I say it's a patent lie because if you read their first patent in 2010, when they formed the company, it actually shows that, in fact, what I just said is absolutely before they, in fact, did figure out ways to use mRNA to write into the human genome. And what we also know is that in the shots that were used for both the Pfizer shot as well as the Moderna shot, in both of them, the agent pseudouridine was used, as well as the unfortunate use of a number of fats, basically fat envelopes that were used to actually deliver the agent into the body. And these lipid particles, which are actually part of the delivery system, were actually known to be toxic agents when they were created. So this was not something that is an after effect discovery. This was known to be a toxin. More importantly, if you actually set aside the lipid nanoparticle for a moment and you go back to the pseudouridine as part of the injection to stabilize the mRNA so that it actually would find its way into the cell and do its work, what you find before the pseudouridine case is that it is an active cancer promoter. It does it by doing two things. It actually switches on some cancer behavior, but it also shuts down the body's natural response to fight cancer. And all of us, every single one of us, has atypical cell growth happening at some point somewhere. When that goes out of control, we call it cancer. And when we let it go further out of control, we call it metastatic cancer. And what you're finding, Brian, is what's called stage 4 cancer on diagnosis. Now, stage 4 and cancer on diagnosis shouldn't be said in the same sentence, because it turns out that stage 4 talks about the maturity of that cancer. That's an indication of how aggressive or how long or how comprehensive that cell line has been established. When you find cancer at stage 4, what it means is there's an accelerant. Something is going on where something is not only triggering the hypertrophic growth, but the other side of it is the suppressors, which are natural in our body, the things that actually bring down cancer as a response, are being themselves suppressed. So what we're left with is a pro-cancer trigger, and then we shut down the anti-cancer response that's normal in the body. And to that end, what I've said when I talk about a third of the world's population being incapacitated is that between the people who actually have diagnosed disease, you have to realize that for every one of those people, Brian, at least 2 other people have to be impacted in their care. So even if, let's just take the best case scenario where we only have 10% that actually have active cancers and active disease conditions, which is only 800 million people. But let that number settle in for 800 million people. If only 10% have the most pathogenic response, we still have 2 times that number, another 1.6 billion people who are going to be required for their care. Now, you know, and I know, because we're of the age to know, that when you start dealing with an aging parent or you start dealing with a disabled spouse, the overall productivity you have in your life goes because you stop being productive. As a matter of fact, you become more productive. You have to do your job and take care of somebody. But over a period of time, what we're going to see is the incapacitation of society as an employable and engageable unit. And that means that a third of the population, either directly through their own harm or as the casualty of caretaking, will in fact be incapacitated by 2020.
Wow. That's a massive statement. And that's going to have a massive impact on the economy, on everything.
Absolutely. And this is the reason why, once again, I say, when I talk about an act of warfare, remember, the Greeks used to do this. The Romans used to do it. We've done it here in the United States. Remember that warfare comes in a bunch of different forms. And because we still see people going on planes, eating holidays and doing all the things, we actually go, it's not a world at war. But that's because we're thinking about the old school black and white newsreel war. We're thinking about trenches and guns, and we're thinking about helmets, and we're thinking about fatigues, and we're thinking about what Hollywood delivers to us as warfare. But what we're not paying attention to, and this is really critical, is the number of people who are not engaging in the economy. Watch what's happening. And by the way, every country that bought the COVID nonsense is having exactly the same response. The number of employable people under the age of 40 is going down. And it's staggering. And you look at it and go, well, hold on a minute. That's a problem. Because for economies to last and for society to last, we need to have the period of time between our late teens and our early 50s. We need that period of time to be filled with constructive and productive engagement. And that is not happening. In fact, the numbers are going the wrong way. So we see all of the indications that we would have seen in any other condition. The same number of people dead and dying, the same number of casualties in terms of morbidity and mortality. We see the same thing as any other war, but because it was done with lab coats, we don't think it's war.
You know, one thing I think the public is opening their eyes to are all these very strange, catastrophic health incidents that we don't remember seeing before. These athletes that are, falling down dead during games, these young people that are having these heart attacks. I mean, I'll be honest, David, even when recently, Catherine, the Princess of Wales, she comes down with cancer and she's like 40 something. And it's just, look, I have a scientific background and I try to catch myself from these anecdotes, but my reaction was, since when does this young, vibrant person come down with something like that? I just don't remember that in occurring. And again, anybody else will say, oh, you're coming to conclusions or no evidence, et cetera. But there's a point where so many of these incidents stacking up. We have people like, Ed Dowd and other people that kind of run these numbers and try to track this. But when will we ever know if these things are all mRNA related?
Well, what we do know already is that they are shot related. As hard as it was for him to publish it, Peter McCullough's publication a few weeks ago was actually quite good in terms of highlighting the post-injection mortality data, which was unambiguously the case. And what we do know, Brian, regardless of how we do the counting, we don't have to go into the kind of causal anecdote connection you just alluded to, where we have a problem with, do we see more people falling over dead on the field because we were watching more people on the field? We can make 1,000 arguments to how that could be an anomaly based on some other covariating factor. But what we can do with absolute certainty is look at the data that is in fact reported, whether it's on the VAERS or whether it is on the actual pandemic adverse event data. And what we do know is that by over tenfold, we have more deaths and more adverse events than we've had in the history of all previous interventions around vaccinations or immunoreactive agents that we put into the population. So setting aside the anecdote for a moment, the data already is screaming off the page. This thing was lethal. And we knew it was, by the way. We knew it was when they launched the thing. I mean, I was, as you know, in the beginning of 2020, long before there was even conversation about who would be getting these injections and how they would be delivered and whether it would be compulsory or all those things. You know that Kim and I were doing our Butterfly of the Week videos and we were warning people, stay away from these things. This is deadly. It's not maybe going to be problematic. It will be deadly. And we were laying down all those pieces of information because by 2018, Brian, We knew the pseudouridine thing. That was published science, which means that by including it into the shot, both Pfizer and Moderna willfully killed human beings. And I want to say that unambiguously. Now, they will argue that it was for a greater good. But here's the problem. That's actually a false statement too, because public health as a ethic says that the greater good has to have a salutary benefit somewhere down the road for the greater good calculus to work. There has to be a cost-benefit analysis where the benefit clearly and compellingly outweighs the cost. But here's the problem in this one. And this is why the Ninth Circuit, which just recently ruled favorably on the LAUS Unified School District case that I and George Wentz and others were supporting with the Health Freedom Defense Fund. If you go back and you look at the arguments that were made with respect to the government's arguments and the state of California's arguments around public health, they keep saying that this was a vaccination that actually was supposed to at least limit or somehow suppress the transmission of a disease. But we knew that was never the case. None of the clinical trials were ever set up to do that. And so here's the problem. Well, with a cost-benefit analysis, all we have is cost. There is no benefit. Saying somebody didn't go to the hospital is saying that I don't have a monster in my closet. I wasn't going to go to the hospital anyhow. Saying I wasn't going to spend as much time in the hospital, which was the actual clinical trial endpoint, is ludicrous. I wasn't going to the hospital in the first place. So count me as not going to the hospital. And by the way, also not staying very long. Well, no kidding, because I didn't go to the hospital in the first place. They created a falsifiable context in which allegedly a benefit was hypothecating. And we see this time and time again. People say, oh, tens of thousands or millions of people were allegedly saved extreme cases of disease because they got the shot. That's absolute, excuse the French, bullshit. That cannot be true because the injection did nothing but tell the body, and let's be very clear on what it said. It was the instructions of a computer code created in a biologically synthesized form to tell your body to become a biological weapons manufacturing facility. You were making the bomb that was supposed to hit you. Nothing about that shot, not one thing about that shot was meant to trigger an immune response. The shot was to trigger the creation of a pathologic substance in your body, to which the hope, and remember, Brian, I'm saying this because that's all they had. The hope was having made the pathogen, your body would be smart enough to figure out how to make the antidote for that pathogen. Nothing about this shot survives the test of public health. Nothing about this survives the test of any of the requirements that were meant for the requirements to meet the public health mandate. And as a result, like I said, the Ninth Circuit correctly said the Jacobson precedent from 1905, which was the smallpox injection mandates in Massachusetts, the Jacobson precedent in 1905 was wrongly applied because there was no public health benefit in this exercise whatsoever.
David, is the mainstream media now admitting this or acknowledging this? And obviously, Fauci was rolled out in front of, Congress recently and examined. Did we get anywhere with that? When you see that, what did you see happening? And is this now being acknowledged by the mainstream media or not really?
Well, unfortunately for the mainstream media, the numbers are now overwhelming their nonsense cover story that it's all okay. Now, that said, I think MSNBC is going to go to its grave, denying that there's anything other than the illusion in which they live. I don't think they'll ever come around. But you do have BBC, CNN, Fox, and others who are starting to talk about the fact that after injections, people are suffering. And you're starting to see those stories show up in network affiliates around the world. So yes, we're starting to see some of that. But what we're seeing is a characterization of some sort of general lethargy and malaise that is hitting the global population, where people are suddenly having an amazing amount of cardiovascular disease, an amazing amount of cancers, an amazing amount of other things. And we're trying to come up with the reason why that's happening. And the causal link here is still being missed. And guess what was not discussed at any of the congressional hearings? None of the congressional hearings talked about the premeditation problem. None of them talked about the fact that when Anthony Fauci recommended mRNA as a pathway, he knew he was going to kill people by virtue of the uridine. He knew it. It was published Science in 2018. He knew that when he said to use remdesivir, also invented and created by Ralph Baric, the architect of the bioweapon itself, he knew when he said that, he knew that 53% of the population in which remdesivir was used in the African Ebola trials died, and I quote from the paper, regardless of viral load, meaning that healthy people without Ebola were murdered with remdesivir. Let's get really clear. None of those facts, none of the premeditation of the death and destruction of American and global citizens, not one of those issues was raised by any of the congressional investigation. They're hiding behind this effort, desperately hiding behind the effort to try to make sure that they can recite that this was a lab leak from China. But Brian, you know that I said this from the beginning. This was patented in North Carolina. The Chinese Wuhan Institute of Virology virus, number one, was manipulated through gain-of-function research funded by Anthony Fauci's NIAID. In writing, the proof of that is in October of 2014. There is no question about the truth of what I'm saying. The weapon was built in America, deployed in America, and used against American citizens by Americans. We must stop this nonsense of pretending that somehow or another a bat and a pangolin walked into a bar in a wet market in China and somehow mysteriously the world got sick. That is absolutely 100% ludicrous, and none of that story and none of the investigations to try to reify that story are worth their weight in air.
Yeah, even though it's all in black and white, and you laid that out in detail in Plandemic 2 and then in subsequent pieces. You know, you've been very clear about this for the last 4 years, and that still has not been admitted to or even picked up at this point. Yeah, like you said, it was either the bat, or maybe you get to the fact that it was Wuhan and then it's some China's fault, but nobody brings it all the way back to the intention of Fauci, which is something you've always said, which again shocked people.
Well, and remember, let's get really, really clear for people who like to nitpick. 18 U.S. code makes it illegal for anyone to upload the sequence of a biological or chemical weapon from a foreign country in the United States. That is a violation, felony violation of the 18 U.S. code. So let's be abundantly clear. I'm not making an allegation. I'm making an accusation. This is very, very distinct. When Ralph Baric said he uploaded the sequence from the Chinese government in 2014 and then subjected that to gain-of-function research so that he could weaponize the Wuhan Institute of Virology virus one, his words, not mine, he thanked the Wuhan Institute of Virology for giving them the sequence in the 2016 paper that said it was poised for human emergence. All of these things are published facts. So this whole charade of trying to come up with a story that says there was a oops in Wuhan is covering up felony crimes in the United States. And the reason I keep hammering this point is even if something happened in China, and I'm, by the way, not a sympathizer of China, I am not at all, because I think what they're doing is morally and ethically reprehensible. But let's get really clear. If we pretend like the problem is over there, while we let the felons in the United States continue their practice, then guess what's going to happen next? H5N2, the bird flu, all of these other things are going to be the natural follow-up, and giant shock, which I'm sure surprises nobody, the alleged H5N, the avian influenza, which is supposed to be terrifying the world right now.
Yeah, let's talk about this.
For sale at the BEI Resources corporate website, and is incorporated into patents as early as 2016. H5N2, the never seen it before pathogen. You could buy commercial from the business that is run by NIAID called BEI resources. Does that sound like something that's never been seen before? If you can go into a catalog and buy it.
Wow. And you're referring to this current bird flu that is potentially the next thing. It's also the thing that's being talked about somewhat. And you're talking about that specific piece. What do you think is going to...
And guess what? Giant surprise. Moderna just got I think $175 million contract to build the next mRNA injections for bird flu. Brian, the reason why these things are problematic is because the population thinks COVID is over. But because we always called it a pandemic and we stopped calling it the propaganda warfare component of the Third World War, we're watching the next round be loaded into the gun. And we're paying no attention to the fact that the same perpetrators who are conducting the same genocide are going to do it all over again. And this time we're just going to call it bird flu or disease X. And by doing that, we are going to justify another round of lethality where tens of thousands of people will die on the spot. Hundreds of thousands, if not millions, will die as a secondary effect of the mRNA. And giant surprise, we'll sit there going, who could have seen it coming? And the answer is we all, and we willfully looked away.
Yeah, and you said this last time. You said, Brian, this is just a criminal conspiracy, and they're going to keep running this for as long as we allow them to run it, and you're just going to see the
That's exactly right.
Iterations. What did you make of the Fauci testimony?
Well, I am saddened by the fact that people thought that something was accomplished. I actually think that he probably laughed and went out and had beers afterwards. And the reason I say that is because, well, the theater was what it was, which is the Republicans on the committee needing to beat up somebody. And so they decided to beat up Fauci. What that does is serve as good sound bites for fundraisers to go out and raise money among your constituencies saying, look, we held the little guy accountable. But until there is a criminal felony charge leveled against him for premeditated murder, for manslaughter, for domestic terrorism, for violation of 18 U.S. Code violations around biological and chemical weapons, until the felony charge is done, no one's been held accountable. This idea that we publicly shame someone in the town square, that we throw rotten tomatoes at him for 4 or 5 hours and we put him in the stocks, and then he goes home and takes a shower is perfectly fine. And he doesn't have any consideration whatsoever for the financial gain that he got. Did you see anybody suggest that he actually give up the money that NIAID received in license payments when, I might add, under his watch, while he was at NIAID, he failed to disclose 100% of the patents. When asked by Congress in the fall of 2020 whether or not NIH would be enriched by the recommendations they were making, he failed to disclose all of the patents for which he got paid. And those were hundreds of millions of dollars of payments that came to him, which he never disclosed to a congressional budget office investigation. These crimes, Brian, are so egregious, so over the top in their scale, that it is a true tragedy that the accountability has now been mocked to the point where we say that the hearings were somehow accountability. This ludicrous nature that says, well, he shouldn't have funded the $3 million with EcoHealth Alliance for the Peter Daszak thing, 3.6 or 3.8 million, depending on which numbers you count. But the problem with even that story is it misses the fact that the first DARPA NIAID partnership with EcoHealth Alliance in Wuhan started in 2005. Not the $3.8 million you hear about in 2018 and 2019. I'm talking about the tens and tens of millions of dollars that directly went into that partnership and the billions of dollars that went into the weaponization of the Wuhan, SARS-CoV-2 modified chimera. All of that stuff is silent. Nobody talks about it. And as I said in an interview I recently did, Brian, I think you might have seen pieces of this with Alex Jones. I said, the reason why none of those congressional delegates are willing to ask this question is because the universities in their home jurisdictions are the money launderers for this black op. You're not going to get the state of North Carolina to ask an ethics question when the state of North Carolina is cashing the biggest checks. You're not going to get Tennessee to ask the question. You're not going to get Kentucky to ask the question. You're definitely not going to get Texas to ask the question, or Virginia, or any of the places where the criminals are cashing the checks, because it turns out that they know that they have to keep that quiet. We cannot talk about black ops funding of illicit research in our universities because, one, it's a cash cow that keeps the universities building new buildings and doing all the new initiatives and doing all the endowments and doing all the things they want to do. The public sector is underwriting the weapons manufacturers called universities, and no one's willing to call it out.
Looks like we might have potentially a new president coming up. And one of the big criticisms of Trump was how he handled the pandemic. Yeah. And I'm curious,
To continue watching the rest of the episode for free, visit our website, londonreal.tv, or click the link in the description below.
Most people will never see this opportunity. Dubai luxury transformation projects have historically delivered 40 to 90% annual returns. That is incredible. These were once reserved only for insiders with access. I spent 15 years on Wall Street, and I learned this: the biggest returns always go to the people who get the call first. Now, you finally can. We've just received a brand new project with major upside potential. Allocations move fast. Click the link, apply now, and speak to my team. This is your chance to see what others never will.